Just to kick it off, Mark, when you look at what has happened, what's gone on with these two major events that had national notoriety, what are some of the first thoughts you have that come to mind when looking at these situations?
I think, what we learned so far for both of these events is that they're tied to, a level of technical debt that each of the entities had, right? I mean, they had, I think in Southwest case, we're talking about a scheduling system that had largely been outgrown by the company. And I think they've been aware of that for quite some time. And in the case of the FAA, they had a little bit more of an event that was of a technical nature. Whereas, Southwest was more, it started what kicked off the snowball, so to speak, was, all of the weather related delays, and they had to make a bunch of changes, very quickly. And it was that their systems weren't capable of handling the business needs in that moment. But, from a lot of feedback I've seen, it was pretty predictable, and they've known about that for the last few years. So I think that'd be the first takeaway I have, is that, they're both battling something that's very similar to a lot of businesses that have been around for a little while. I mean, if you just started your business in the last 5 years, you probably don't have as much of this. But
Sure.
anything older than that, you've probably got some legacy decisions, or software or hardware or technology of some sort that is no longer up to speed with what your business is doing. And you just have dealt with it because it works. But there's a risk component that comes with that.
I happen to be at the airport on Wednesday when the FAA outage went out, and it was definitely interesting to see. My flight was impacted, and wasn't that bad. It was about a 30-minute delay, but there was definitely a lot of people there that were not very happy because their flights got overall canceled. But as I've been reflecting on that this week, I had an important meeting to go to. Now, if my flight was canceled, I didn't make that meeting that I had been on somebody's calendar for over 2 months. That would be very hard to reschedule. I don't know if I've had the same impact, but it leads me to the thought about business impact to the end user, right? So while in itself it was a pretty bad a bruise, a little black eye, they got up they fixed the issue within a couple of hours. Southwest Airlines, not so much. And I think if you look at the disparities between the two, a lot more outages. But talk to me a little bit about what your perspective is on the end user business impact. Obviously, they have business rules, they have responsibilities, they have their own methods of keeping their business up and running. But what happens, or how do you look at it through the lens of the customer and how it could potentially impact them?
So, the risk equation, right? One half of that is, what's it going to cost us? It's the impact of the event, and that can be difficult to project sometimes. But to your point, again, at its core, for both of these events, it was an outage, right, of some sort. So that's where they're similar. But then I think they diverge from there. One, the nature and the cause of it, but two, the impact of it. Like you mentioned, the FAA recovered much more quickly than Southwest did, but also the FAA affected all airlines, not just Southwest, right? So slightly different scopes. Southwest was a much larger outage than the FAA was, both in terms of time and impact. I think, and this is going to be the implication, I guess I'll say, because there's only so much information at this point.
Right.
I believe the FAA was much more prepared for their outage than Southwest was for theirs. So that can probably tie directly to business continuity plan, or maybe even an incident response plan. There was, the first thought I had in mind particularly for the FAA event, because there's a little bit more acute happening, was, hey, cyber attack, right? That's the first thing you want to roll out.
Sure.
And of course, that's what your incident response plan will help you do. But even after you've determined it's not a cyber attack, you've still got to have your plans for restore, right? And being able to survive the disruption. And by the way, there's a component of this that you can't control, which is luck. Luck plays into this a little bit too, in terms of how effectively you can get restored. So I think that the impact and the cost for FAA was much lower than the one for Southwest. I think that I read an estimate in the last couple of days that the cost of the outage and the disruption for Southwest Airlines is projected to be about $800 million.
That's wild.
The question, I think, is would it have cost them $800 million to upgrade their systems? I'm guessing the answer to that's no, right? I mean, the cost of an event is almost never cheaper after the fact.
How does this happen? You have a multi-billion-dollar company that knows of a problem and knows of a challenge, yet they continue to go down a path with, I'm going to call it antiquated, and I think I'm being nice, technology, right? And even so for the FAA too. I mean, from the research you've done, I think both organizations were using pretty antiquated systems that probably have reached their end of useful life. Mm-hmm. How does that happen to entities that work with millions of people on a daily basis? How does that not reach the heights of addressing when it needs when it's already been identified as being archaic software or technology?
So at the highest level, the answer to that is just decision making. But it's either not understanding the risk, or B, it's understanding the risk and not and just missing your bet, basically, right? And that's kind of where I look at these two events a little bit differently. The FAA took a risk and, I'll say survived it without too much impact. Southwest took a risk and lost big time. And at the end of the day, risk, where we talk about risk, or I think about risk in terms of gambling, right? They're very similar, right? And except here's the difference: when you do it in your business like this, if I go drop $100 on a bet for the next football game, I only have $100 at risk. It's all upside. There's no more downside from there, right? But when I make the decision not to spend, to invest in my infrastructure, whether that's time or money, there's a lot more downside. It's not just the cost savings. Let's say, I'm just throwing out a number here, that for Southwest, that cost would have been $300 million. That's a big, big number for them to look at and say, hey, let's spend this to upgrade our systems. Because it's not only the technical cost, it's also the people, the training, the implementation, so forth. Their bet was that, we'll not spend the $300 million, we'll make this other profits as we go along, and we will not suffer this type of event. They've missed on that one, right? That's always going to be the case. Your technology is always going to fail or not meet the moment at some point without some type of maintenance.
I think there's lessons here for small and medium businesses, right? Because if you know that there's a problem, if you know that you've outgrown your system, and you know that it really can't meet the demands of your users, especially if your user base is growing, especially during your planning, you've got to identify it. You really have to have a good understanding of how critical this risk, what is the impact and likelihood to my organization? How high is that? And again, it goes back to what we tell our customers about. There's this risk threshold that every decision that you make, you have to have this risk acceptance number or criteria. And if anything in your business exceeds that threshold as an inherent risk, you probably need to address it sooner rather than later, because if you don't, I mean, these things are at a global scale, but I guarantee you the economies of scale and the magnitude would be just as impactful in the small, medium business in the same exact situation, right?
Well, continuing the gambling analogy, right? The fellow that made the bet on the Jaguars, his losses were capped at $11,000 or whatever the number was. Your losses in a small business are also capped. They're capped, though, at the failure of your business. Like, it can go all the way up to that point, because these these events, if you think about, again, a little bit more publicized for the Southwest piece, the event has a bunch of risk that was realized and became an event that not only impacted Southwest, right? They've got to refund all of these, flight purchases. They've got to, probably refund some fees. They've got to cover some costs from people that they incurred as a result of the event. But they're also taking a reputational hit.
Big time.
They're also taking, like, how much of their time right now do you believe is spent on moving the business forward? Because I'm guessing almost the entire organization is focused on how to recover from this event, and then there's going to be some time about how do they prevent it going forward. I'll be interested to see, will they make a decision to upgrade their software at some point, in the relatively near future as a result of this. But
I've heard you say this plenty of times before, Mark, about, small, medium businesses are only one event away from going under. And it even doesn't have to be a cybersecurity or physical security related event, man. It is just, if you don't look at risk in your organization, that's just, you're going to be in trouble. I mean, I don't know what other nicer way to say it, but it happens every single day. And the only time you hear about it is when it's on your mainstream media and it's big and it's grandiose, right? But I guarantee you that events like this happen every day for small, medium businesses because they didn't take the time, to your point, invest in those areas where they need to from a technology standpoint, or really have a good, solid incident response business continuity plan to walk through those events. Because like you say, in past times, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It will happen. Right. You just have to be prepared to do it. So, I mean, our key takeaways for you, if there was one lesson that could be applied from this situation for our listeners, what would be your one point to drill home for small, medium-sized business owners?
I think that it's probably the same message we have with all of these discussions. And it's mostly about awareness. It's awareness for your environment, understanding the risks that are involved, understanding the assets that are involved. As a small business, you rely on a number of things, right? I mean, all businesses are just a compilation of people and assets and process, right? So it's people, process, technology. What are the risks that are associated with those? What are the value that's associated with those? How do those two things compare? And what protections, what intentional decisions are you making around that equation? Again, this stuff that we're talking about today, the events that plays out in the media because it is of a grand scale, but to your point, every business has them in concepts. They just kind of, the ebb and flow based on, the individual decisions, or excuse me, the individual specifics of businesses. But you as a business owner, you don't necessarily have to be a technology expert. In fact, most of us aren't, right? It's more that you do have to be an expert in your own business, though. And to the extent that technology or process or people impact any area of your business, you need to understand that. Again, not necessarily all the details, but you've got to understand the bigger picture about how they connect and how the flows are impacted, so that when you make a decision, whether it's a decision in people, a decision in process, or a decision in technology, how does that impact the equation of how they go together that then is supporting your overall business results? And so, kind of tying this back to the event, understand what protections you have in place to prevent something like this from happening. But then on the other side of that, what plans do you have in place to respond if the event happens? And that gets overlooked even more so than the protections piece.
Mm-hmm. I love it, man. This is just always good to have these conversations and to look at it. And hopefully, for those of you listening, take these things to heart. Look at when you see major events like this happening, especially around business decisions. I would always ask yourself, how can I what could I learn from this situation? I always like to say that if the best lessons I've ever learned in my life come from the performance of people who have done it poorly or just had more problems doing it than I did. But I've learned a lot of lessons from that. And I think our listeners can absolutely take away what you've shared here and really, from a big picture, look at this event and say, I don't want to be like them, and maybe I should start looking at my business with a magnifying glass.
Yeah, two thoughts there, Mike. There's the old saying, or at least I think it's an old saying. I don't know. I ran across it somewhere. It's experience is learning from your own mistakes. Wisdom is learning from others. Right. So
that's right, man.
There's that part. But then the second thing is these two events also kind of highlighted over the last 10 years or so, the conversation around what's the risk around my technology is about security, right? All day long. It's cybersecurity, cybersecurity, cybersecurity. Before that evolved, the biggest threat to your business is what just happened. It's the failure of your technology, and causing the business outages. When you're talking about understanding your risk, it's not just about the security aspect. It's about all layers of it and components of it. And I think that's something to, for business owners and decision makers to really take to heart as well. But to your point, when these things happen, are there lessons that can be learned that just because Southwest or the FAA are tens of thousands of employees, that doesn't mean that a 25 to 75 person business shouldn't be able to have some corollaries and draw, new decisions or lessons from that.
I agree with you, man. All right. Well, Mark, thank you for your time this morning. As always, enjoyed doing this with you. And hopefully you guys will join us again soon for the next edition of the SMB for your SMB. Take care. Have a great day.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.